I'd like to welcome everyone back and introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Randy Kearns, who is a researcher and Space Land Disaster Coordinator at the University of North Carolina. Randy?
Yes, thank you, Frank. First of all, mic check. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Let's go ahead and proceed. Again, I'm Randy Kearns. I'm with the University of North Carolina. I'll be talking to you today about the physics of earthquakes. We'll also talk about how they impact the American healthcare system and some of those things that they have to do. I've been involved in disaster medicine, working on the things as the fire disaster program at the background is that I university that work with burn centers throughout the United States. I think I might have been working in Folks, I have to apologize. I was in Washington yesterday to do a presentation. I'm not sure if you noticed the news, but we got snowed in. I'm still waiting on flights this afternoon. I apologize for that. We've been not having video feed, but our bandwidth is pretty narrow. It gives us some voice, and that's about it. And I still can't advance the slides. Correct. Okay. 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 Muted on my computer. Got it. Okay.
Now you just don't have to come over that.
Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and finish. Okay. Folks, just a couple of things. First of all, why is this important to me? It's certainly in the nature of the things that we've seen with earthquakes in the last couple of years, and I'll kind of highlight a couple of things that's happened in the past year. How it impacts the healthcare system, how it impacts our ability to respond, certainly makes it necessary for us to have a good understanding of what's going on, at least to the extent of what basic science is. I do have to offer a couple of disclaimers. First of all, I'm not a seismologist and I'm not a geologist. My background is healthcare administration and disaster medicine. But I think it is important to, again, understand the basics of disasters, particularly as they relate to earthquakes and how they relate to what we do in disaster medicine. Next. So we'll start out just by talking about a couple of earthquakes, just hitting the highlights of Haiti and Chile, and again, a couple of reminders of what goes on in the United States. Just as a reminder, January 12th, 7.0 magnitude. The epicenter intensity was intensity of 12. We'll talk about why that's important, particularly as a responder. 300,000 injured, 1.3 million displaced, nearly 230,000 killed. shallow earthquake, again, shortly I'll talk about the difference between where the hypocenter was of the actual earthquake and then where the epicenter was, and why that's important, again, to us as responders. Next. And graphically, just a couple of pictures to remind us of what went on in Chile, and as you saw in the previous presentation, obviously those folks dealt with something that was quite horrific. Next. And next. And next. Just one of the pieces here, so many pictures from Haiti reminded us that much of the rescue, although a great deal of coverage was lent to the international responders, who certainly did an extraordinary job. Quite frankly, in just about every situation, the first responders are people that live in the community and that they use whatever they have available to try and affect those early rescues. Next. So about a month and a half later, an 8.8 magnitude earthquake occurred in Chile. The epicenter intensity was 10, and again, I'll draw some distinctions shortly about why that was different. Also notice the number of killed, 577 compared to nearly 230,000 people. Yet the earthquake intensity in terms of energy release in Chile was more than 500 times greater than that of what occurred in Haiti. Again, lower intensity in terms of what went on at the epicenter, and then clearly some big differences in building composition and building code, which in Chile is a lot more like what we have in the States in terms of areas that are earthquake prone. Next. Again, just graphically reminding you an 8.8 magnitude. At that point, 279 was the death toll. I think the total death toll was 577, but $30 billion in damage. And although certainly this is catastrophic, and there's a number of buildings that had catastrophic damage to them in Chile, as you can tell from this, there are enormous voids that are open in these structures that allowed for substantial survival, and that was characteristic of the building construction in Chile. And again, that's why that's important to us as responders in the United States. That's what we're more likely to confront when the next big earthquake strikes in the United States. Obviously, overhead roadway collapse. Nothing unlike what we're used to seeing, particularly on the West Coast, with a couple of the more recent earthquakes that we probably remember, Loma Prieta, the Northridge quake. Next. So again, when I talk about the and, there was a 2.1 magnitude earthquake in New Jersey on Christmas Day, a 3.4 magnitude in Washington, D.C. on July the 16th. The U.S. Geological Survey has a website, Did You Feel It, that allows people to log in and say, I felt an earthquake. Well, there was over 21,000 reports after the 3.4 magnitude tremor in Washington, D.C. on July 16th. Again, not an area we typically associate with earthquakes, but shortly I'll talk about faults, and just as a reminder of why that's possible, not just possible in Washington, D.C., but why it's possible throughout all of the United States. Next. So the basics. What is an earthquake? Next. A couple of terms that I want to be sure we understand the difference between. So there's the actual earthquake itself, and then those shocks that occur after the earthquake, we refer to them as aftershocks. And quite honestly, there's shocks that we classify as foreshocks. Honestly, we don't know that that's what they are, since it's a precursor to something that hasn't happened yet. But shocks that occur before the earthquake are foreshocks. Shocks that occur after the earthquake are aftershocks. And then, of course, you have generally one significant event. There are some atypical situations The New Madrid quakes of 1811 and 1812 are good examples. Greater than 7.5 magnitude, all three of them, and all three earthquakes basically spaced over a 4-month period of time. But other terms that are important, a hypocenter is the actual calculated center of where the energy was released from the earthquake. We typically think about the epicenter, and the epicenter is actually that point on the Earth's surface above where the hypocenter is. The distance between the epicenter and hypocenter is important. Also, the composition of what's in between. Again, what we saw in Haiti, although it was only a 7.0 magnitude, there was enormous damage because the distance between the hypocenter and the epicenter was very close. But again, why is that important to us as responders? Because it creates enormous damage. That enormous damage is stuff that we have to be, certainly mindful of in terms of our response into the area, and also the nature and criticality of the injuries that we're going to be seeing and how we deal with that. The Richter scale or magnitude, and then the modified Macaulay scale or intensity, I'll discuss that later. And then the other two words that I think are important for us to know, if you shape certain types of soil to where they lose their ability, where the small pieces of the soil lose its ability to adhere to itself, it begins to function like a liquid. That's referred to as liquefaction. So when you hear about something being shaken and how buildings fall down in pretty dramatic ways, particularly over area that's been filled, that's where liquefaction occurs. And then the last word that we all know after the Christmas Day tsunami of 2005, just how horrific that can be. And again, that huge sea wave is caused by an earthquake, generally offshore. So how earthquakes happen, again, the place in the earth where the actual energy release took place is the hypocenter and the area around that. That's where the focus of energy waves are given off. And that place that we measure it on the surface of the earth, we refer to that as the epicenter. Next. We originally, again, in science, sometimes it takes us a while to embrace ideas that actually are the correct ideas. But there was a scientist in 1912, a gentleman by the name of Alfred Wegener, who proposed a paper in 1912 called drift hypothesis, and then 1915 followed that up with origin of content. Again, for the most part, he was some of his ideas were considered laughable, but he envisioned the fact that there was probably one large land mass that over millions of years drifted apart. He referred to that large land mass as Pangea, and his basis for that was because there were places on the shore of East, South America, and West Africa where there were bird species and plant species that were very similar. And his only conclusion was at some point those things had to be connected. And aside from the fact that it looks like a kid putting two pieces of puzzle together, maybe it made sense that those two pieces drifted apart. Now, a couple of other scientists, Oliver Holmes and both the Hess and Dietz paper in 1962 and 1961, they began to measure that there were actual places in the seafloor spreading. And honestly, by 1965, science began to embrace the notion of plate tectonics. Next, we'll talk about why that's important. So there are actually a number of ways, but the three primary ways that we see different plates of the earth shifting, and the shifting is when this pressure builds up and then is released, that is expressed as an earthquake. But for the most time, I know referred to as a divergent, which is two surfaces pulling apart, convergent, which is where one surface pushes down under the other, and then the third is where plates are sliding beside each other, which are transformational plates. The San Andreas Fault is a good example of transformation plate. So when you think about those plates and the crust of the earth around the earth, places that the most activity takes place, that's what it looks like. Now, to envision how these plates actually move, there's a couple of things that visualize. First of all, if you look at a very old piece of china, from a distance, it's this one large plate, okay? But if you look up close, you'll see these small fractures, these small fissures that have occurred over time because of either heating or use or maybe somebody dropped it. But, the point is there are small, minute cracks, in some places much larger than others. But that's basically the way the surface of the Earth is. You've got places where there are distinct cracks, where there's this constant motion that takes place. And it's very difficult to measure, but a good way to visualize that constant movement is think about your fingernails. You can't see them grow. If you sit there and look at them, they're not going to grow in front of you. Yet, every couple of days or a week or so, you're clipping your nails for that reason, because they are growing. And it's for that same example that the surface of the Earth in certain places, particularly along these plate boundaries, are moving. And then there are certain other fault lines outside of those plate boundaries. The largest plates where the most activity is often referred to the nomenclature as the ring of fire. Anyway, I hope that graphically gives you a better idea of what we're talking about. And again, folks, I'm sorry you can't see me, but again, I hope this is being helpful to you. Next. So if we look at basically 10 years of activity, 1980 to 1990, and we overlay the actual activity of measurable earthquakes magnitude 5 or greater, and then we overlay those magnitude 5 or greater earthquakes over the crustal boundaries of those plates, you'll see where a majority of that earthquake activity takes place. Next. So, again, let's kind of dig a little bit further into the basics of magnitude versus intensity. So many times we hear people refer to, there's been an earthquake, and the magnitude is a 6.7 on the Richter scale, or 6.7 magnitude. What does that mean to me? Honestly, I don't know that number is terribly important for us as responders as the modified Mercalli index, which gives us an idea of how much intensity took place, how widespread the damage, what type of damage we're talking about. And I've got a couple of slides that identify that. Next. So again, the Richter scale is that fixed value of magnitude. It measures that one release of energy at that one hypocenter, again, the area above the surface of the Earth where that energy is released. We refer to as the epicenter. But that's that one point. And although that number is somewhat important and does give us an idea of how much energy was released, the expression of that energy release is really what concerns us as responders. Because, if there's places where there's substantial building collapse or there's bridge collapse, understanding what the intensity is and how widespread the intensity is will give us an idea of what type of injury, crush injury, what type of problems we're going to encounter as we get into those areas. Next. So again, the Richter scale is probably the numbers that we're going to see. Something under 6 we felt that didn't cause a lot of damage. Something over 6 can be destructive in at least the immediate area. A 7 to 7.9 are major earthquakes, and 8 or greater are great earthquakes, producing serious and in some cases quite catastrophic damage. Again, the Chilean earthquake was an 8.8, which is quite substantial in normal cases, only because it did not occur, close to the surface of the Earth or occur close to an area where there was lots of population. It obviously could have been a lot worse than it was. Next. So when we think about magnitude scale and the expressiveness in the amount of energy release, it's not linear. And the fact that 6 is the 7 as 200 million is the 400 million. Magnitude 7 to magnitude 8 is 200 million tons of TNT of energy release. It is a good correlation compared to 6 99 million tons of TNT energy release. Again, the difference is exponential. It's not in a linear fashion. So when we talk about great earthquakes or how catastrophic and widespread they can be, when we talk about an 8.0 magnitude with a shallow intensity, we're talking about enormous amounts of damage in a widespread area. So modified Mercalli, and I won't hit this too hard, but the stuff that's 1 through 6, people generally feel movement. There may be some things that fall. You may lose chimneys, you may lose windows, but it's not, substantial damage. People felt it, but it wasn't, terribly big deal. Next. When we start getting into the intensity numbers of 7 to 12, it becomes far more problematic. And again, as responders, that's what's important for us to have an idea of what the intensity is in the area that we're setting up a base camp or we're responding to. If we have an idea, for medical caregivers, a good example of this is how we think about signs and symptoms. What do we see? What do the patients express to us? It's the same way with an intensity index. What do we see and what's expressed by the types of damage that we see that gives us an idea of what, the modified Mercalli scale was or what the intensity was for that particular area. Do you have buildings that are destroyed, how much considerable damage is there? Are railroad tracks bent? Once you get into the intensity 10, 11, and 12, enormous and catastrophic damage, and in some areas it could be widespread. Again, I get back to the 1811, 1812 series of 3 great earthquakes in the New Madrid area were widespread and quite catastrophic. About the only reason it wasn't nearly as bad as it could have been was in 1811, quite frankly, there wasn't a lot of people that lived in that area. But that's Texas. If we, the 1886 earthquake in Charleston, South Carolina occurred on August 31st. If we, and I've got some information about that later that I'll cover, but if we think about comparing and contrasting magnitude with modified Mercalli, so the earthquake occurred, the epicenter was Charleston, South Carolina. Not necessarily an area that we consider prone to earthquakes, but there's actually a fair amount of tectonic activity in that area. So the 7.0 magnitude was the epicenter of ground zero where the earthquake took place. But the intensity was somewhere between a 9 and a 10 in that immediate area. But if you look at how far this thing was felt, you're talking about Milwaukee, you're talking about Florida, it actually was felt in Cuba and felt in Bermuda, it was felt in New York City, it created some sidewalk damage in Washington, D.C. And again, if you think about 1886, more than 75% of the U.S. population lived east of the Mississippi River. So approximately 70% of the U.S. population actually felt this earthquake. Next. Okay, so causes of an earthquake. What causes an earthquake? Next. Now, okay, so let's be quite honest. 200, 300, 400 years ago, if we didn't understand it, we refer to it as an act of God. Today, we may still refer to it that way, but we have a better understanding of the science behind it as well. Generally an earthquake occurs when there's a release of energy. It's expressed by some type of a rupture or movement of rock. And the movement is either moving out from one focal point, and the movement is, again, either lateral or vertical. Two of the earlier scientists to suggest some things that were somewhat novel to how we understood earthquake science. The Japanese scientist, after an 1871 earthquake, was the first one to suggest that an earthquake actually caused the breaking of the ground. We used to think, well, when the ground broke, that caused the earthquake. But he was actually the first one to suggest that and at least documented. And and science accepted that explanation, or at least we later looked back on it and said, well, yeah, I guess he was right. And then Henry Reed, after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, was the first to suggest, okay, well, there's this buildup of pressure and then a huge amount of energy release. Again, giving us an idea of what those foreshots really mean. They do foretell the fact that there could be a major earthquake to follow. Next. So let's think in terms of the threat. I've got some seismic activity maps, and I've got some calculation centers, and we'll talk about kind of how the two interface and again what they mean to us as medical responders. Next. So this goes back to those tectonic plates that we saw earlier. It also gives us a pretty good idea of how those plates encircle the Earth. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake, I might add, occurred within months of an eruption in Europe of a large volcano, Vesuvius. Today we know that the two were not related. But there were a number of others following the 1906 earthquake where, there was serious concern that the Earth was actually coming apart on both sides, and that the eruption of Vesuvius actually was a precursor of the San Francisco earthquake, or the other way around. And the point is the two were really not related, other than the fact that they just both occurred at the same time. Next. So if we look at earthquake hazard areas, certainly we understand the West Coast. There are a number of places there where there's ongoing earthquake activity on a fairly regular basis. Hawaii is an inset. If you want to experience a volcano firsthand at Kilauea and you want to experience earthquake activity on a regular basis, take a trip to Hawaii and then go to Hilo and spend a day on the Big Island. But again, lots of activity on the West Coast, but then areas that we don't necessarily consider as active. The New Madrid Fault, which is in the Booth area of Missouri, the southern tip of Illinois, the western side of Tennessee, which happens to include the city of Memphis. And again, I'll talk about that with some other slides I have later. Certainly Charleston, and some areas in northeast U.S. or New England, which are more problematic than we probably give it credit for. And then certainly Alaska, which has a great deal of activity. Again, just another graphic view of areas in terms of intensity. Next. And then this graphically gives us an idea of how different measured quakes have taken place over a 20-year period from 1957 to 1997. Next. Okay, so let's look at the two and compare that to population centers. Next. Okay, so that's world population. 2004, the dark areas obviously are the higher density areas in terms of where people live. Next. So that's a map that we've seen before. Now let's overlay the two and kind of move back and forth so that we graphically get an idea of, kind of like the old adage, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. But, earthquakes aren't nearly as significant if they're not bringing down lots of buildings and killing lots of people. But again, if these seismic events are occurring where lots of people live, then obviously it becomes more problematic and becomes, far more meaningful to us, to be quite honest. Next. Okay, so the next couple of slides actually will fade these two in. Next. Okay, so you see how the two fade in and out, just to give you an idea of how the tectonic plates. Click it forward again. Okay, so again, you get a feel for where the plates are and then where the population is. Next. I think it will fade in and out one more time just to give you that graphic one more time. Muslims in Pakistan and India have dealt with and continue to deal with, and China for that matter, some very catastrophic events. Okay, so earthquakes versus other natural disasters. How big of a deal is an earthquake, and how does it compare to some other natural disasters? Next. I live in North Carolina. Obviously, one of our primary concerns is hurricanes. I've got to be honest with you folks, the greatest disasters of all time deal with either flooding or earthquakes. If you notice here, the top two are floods in terms of morbidity, mortality. Actually, these are just mortality rates, but the morbidity rates are equally as high. And the Indonesian tsunami in 2004 also was produced by an earthquake. Next. So, one thing that I'm fond of saying is reminding people kind of the definition of how bad is bad. The Big Friday earthquake, which occurred in Alaska in 1964, magnitude 9.2, greatest magnitude earthquake at least reported in the history of the United States. Death toll of 125. Now let's kind of think about where that 125 occurred. Well, 98 were in Alaska, 11 were in California, and 1 was in Oregon. The 11 in California and the 1 in Oregon were killed as a result of a tsunami that swept down the Pacific shore after the earthquake in Prince William Sound. Other things that took place, again, the effects of the earthquake were felt worldwide. Fishing boats were sunk off the coast of Louisiana, and wells were noted flushing water in South Africa. Again, a worldwide event, as has been the case with some other rather dramatic and great earthquakes of the last 150, 200 years. Next. So I don't have my graphic loaded for the Charleston, South Carolina earthquake. Actually, we'll talk offline about how we can make that available to the folks that were able to attend today. But let's hit some of the highlights of the Charleston earthquake in 1886 from the next slide. Okay, so it occurred, that's actually a Friday night, just before 10 o'clock on a really nice August evening in Charleston, South Carolina. If we look back at historical records, we're seeing that there's these wild reports. Again, you think about how the United States, or for that matter, the world was connected in 1886. We were connected primarily by telegraph. So the wild reports that were circulating through the news world was, okay, well, there's a tremor felt in Birmingham, Alabama. There's a tremor felt in Washington, D.C. We're feeling tremors in actually different parts of Kentucky, different parts of Tennessee. But oddly enough, there's no reports coming out of Charleston. But oddly enough, there's nothing coming out of Charleston, and all attempts to contact Charleston are not being successful. And the city was effectively cut off from the rest of the nation for about 24 hours. More than 300 aftershocks in the next 35 years. The number killed is somewhat in question, but somewhere between 60 and 120. Somewhere with the magnitude, our magnitude science in those days is not quite, what it is today, but, somewhere between 6.6 and 7.3. Damaged 2,000 buildings, roughly a fourth of the entire value of the city, adjusted in real dollars, $141 billion damage in 2009 dollars. Again, the quake was felt as far north as Boston, as far south as Cuba, to our east, Bermuda, all parts of generally where people live in the United States, and for that matter, again, the countries of Bermuda and Cuba. Next. Another quake that sometimes we forget was the Queen Anne quake. Didn't kill anyone, but certainly was felt, created some pretty significant damage. Probably the advantage was the epicenter was offshore, but the Queen Anne earthquake occurred, the epicenter was believed to be northeast of Boston in 1755. Now, again, clearly we don't have a lot of good records, but when we think of significant earthquakes, we generally don't think of Boston. We certainly don't think of the east coast of the United States. Next. So let me just hit a couple of highlights of the New Madrid earthquake in 1811 and 1812. December 16th of 1811, very significant earthquake. In terms of magnitude was about 7.9, and then intensity was somewhere in the area of a 7 to a 9 in the area immediately around, actually just south of the town of New Madrid, which is in Missouri. I think it's on the next slide. Next. Okay, that's it. The epicenter was actually a place called Lake St. Francis. The actual lake existed at the time of the earthquake. Because of the shaking and the liquefaction, this is now marshland, and the lake is renewed at that time, doesn't exist today. If you hear people telling stories or relating the news of the day, you'll hear people say things like, there was a time that the Mississippi River flowed backwards for several months. Well, in a way that's correct. What happened was there were different areas where large parts of the earth sank because of liquefaction. And because they sank, it created these large voids that were filled by the rushing of the water from the Mississippi, and it actually flowed backwards to a degree from the Mississippi filling into these voids. Technically the river itself did not flow backwards, but certainly if you're on a riverboat in 1811 and you can't go south because the flow of the river is going north, it's pretty easy to come up with a news report that this went on. And then it went on over a series of the next 4 months. Next. So the next great earthquake, the intensity was, again, somewhere between 8 and a 9 in the immediate area of New Madrid. But as you can tell, Charleston, South Carolina had an intensity of 6. Annapolis, Maryland, an intensity of 4. Toronto, Canada, an intensity of 4. So pretty much all of the East Coast felt it in a pretty dramatic way in some places. Next. So the third of the great earthquakes associated with the New Madrid fault were February 7th, 1812. Again, there were a series of more than 500 aftershocks. Depending on what your news source is or what your scientific evidence is, there's clearly delineated hundreds of aftershocks. And again, the best estimate is more than 500 aftershocks. And again, this period went on for about 4 months between 1811 and 1812. Next. Some of the interplates in terms of what the East Coast is. Again, when we think of earthquakes, we typically think of the West Coast, and certainly the major fault lines in there, the major earthquakes have been there for the United States. But sometimes we think of that only as a Western U.S. event, and that's part of the point of my presentation. We need to think of that in terms of not just the U.S. but most of the world as we know it. Just our idea of what's current, in terms of current history, and in some cases, for my teenage children, sometimes it's been more than a couple of years. So, in terms of earthquakes, it's hundreds of years, so that's what we have to have in mind. Next. So, if we look at a 7.7 magnitude earthquake in the New Madrid fault, and we wanted to look at economic loss in terms of building loss, and just building loss, just the county where the city of Memphis is located is more than a $19 billion loss. Okay. Again, 7.7 magnitude along the New Madrid fault would produce very clearly hundreds of billions of dollars in damage, and most likely thousands, not tens of thousands of deaths in terms of death, morbidity and mortality. Next. Again, this is probably the most recent geological survey has of that in terms of looking at peak acceleration following an earthquake and what are the areas most vulnerable to earthquake. Again, it gives you a good representation of places that are more likely to have and historically have had seismic activity. Next. Impacts in terms of what are things that we should plan for and anticipate. in an earthquake and following an earthquake, specifically as it relates to healthcare and healthcare response. And if your background is not in healthcare, obviously mine is more of my focus because that's more of the response. But clearly there's an enormous response capacity and an enormous response needed to catastrophic events like this. But again, let's talk about morbidity and mortality next. So if we look at this is just one field hospital, pull the data from the Centers for Disease Control, but one field hospital, and this gives us actually a pretty good idea of things that we would see, things not just that we saw in Haiti, but this is actually a pretty good representation of what goes on in most disasters anyway, where there's been significant damage to the healthcare infrastructure. So week one, primarily those who presented to a field hospital had earthquake-related injuries. Okay, week two, week three, week four, the majority of the patients had earthquake-related injuries. Well, guess what? By week five and week six, you see some of those injuries still coming in, but honestly, you have people presenting to the hospital because they're still sick, they still get hurt, they still get injured, and now the difference is, in some cases, the infrastructure no longer supports, the needs of the citizens, and so you have, a number of people presenting at these field hospitals who have other injuries that really don't have any relation to the earthquake itself. It's really become somewhat of a paradox for a disaster medical assistance team. At what point do we need to, kind of step away and let the local community take back over its healthcare needs? Obviously this graphic will tell you that there's no ongoing need in places like Haiti. Next. So again, if we look at some of our numbers, fracture dislocation was the greatest culprit in terms of total numbers of patients that we saw. Although again, if we're looking just at earthquake-related injury, our greatest numbers of earthquake-related injury were crush injury. Okay, so we saw that as a part of earthquake-related. We didn't see as much of that in. Sorry. And I'm not going a little bit deeper. I promise to stay and finish the presentation. Anyway, again, I'm sorry for the background noise. That's kind of the fault of having to spend the afternoon in the airport. Okay, so fractures and dislocation, wound and infection, obviously those are biggest numbers of patients in terms of our total patients. But we saw more of that as a part of our other injury, people presenting with other injuries not earthquake-related at the field hospital, and we did see it as part of their earthquake-related injuries. Crush injury was our greater number of earthquake-related types of injuries. Burn injury, also, again, more of those were seen as other injury as opposed to actually earthquake-related. Next. So infrastructure survivability and planning, let's talk about that just a little bit, again, in terms of the healthcare setting, or that's the focus of healthcare setting. Next. So let's look at the Cincinnati earthquake in 1971. Magnitude 6.6. That's okay. You can go ahead and advance the slide. That's the VA hospital. Now, I'm not sure we can, if we can use a pointer and move it to, I'm not sure if we can do this, but if we can, you see the area of collapse between the building to the northwest section of the slide and the building to the southwest. There you go. That used to be Building 1 and Building 2. This was the VA hospital. Building 1 and Building 2 of the Veterans Hospital in the San Fernando area. 49 people lost their lives in the collapse of that building and the collapse of that hospital during that earthquake. 6.6 magnitude was not that significant. But again, if we think about much of our hospital infrastructure, When you're dealing with a lot of buildings that were built well before earthquake survivability and earthquake engineering in terms of architecture and hospital construction came into being. Now, a good contrast to that is in our next slide, if you'll go ahead and there. Okay, so at first blush, this building kind of looks fine to a degree. This is the Olive View Hospital, and actually it was less than a year old at the time of the earthquake. Now, probably the two things that look a little bit unusual, if you look in the lower right portion of the building itself, you'll see some structural damage. And actually, if you look at the first floor, it looks like everything is somewhat leaning to the left, and that's actually because the entire building shifted. Now, there was no one that was killed in the structure. There was no one killed in the structure, but certainly there was significant shaking of the building at the time of the earthquake. Next. Now a good place to park the ambulance, and this was also at this earthquake at this hospital. Next. That was one of the stairwells. Again, if you looked at that first picture up close, you notice something looked kind of odd. Well, this is one of those odd things, and that was obviously a stairwell completely collapsed. Because this did occur early in the morning, unfortunately, no one was in the stairwell at the time it collapsed. Next. And then the clinic area and clinic space. The entire building had to be demolished, unfortunately, but again, it does give you an idea of how it can be survivable, how you can have a full hospital that does survive the earthquake. People can be evacuated safely and moved to other hospitals as long as you have good construction. Next. Let's talk also briefly about the Northridge earthquake in terms of a magnitude 6.7 intensity was 9. Not a lot of death, but 11 hospitals were damaged and had to be evacuated. I've got some other data related to that. Next. At the clinic building, don't want to speak out of terms. I'm not sure who owned the clinic. I probably should discuss that, but let me just say this was a clinic building. The reason, and you notice the significant damage, that was actually the second floor. The third floor collapsed down to the first floor. Pretty much everything that was on the second floor was destroyed. Now, the fortunate thing was the reason no one was injured was this occurred at 4:30 in the morning. Okay, so there's no one in the clinic building at 4:30 in the morning. Next. But there was a retrospective study done by several researchers. The article was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. A fairly well-constructed study. One of the main things they did was they used a survey tool and surveyed everyone in the immediate area that had evacuations. They looked at 8 specific hospitals that were evacuated. And I don't want to go over a lot of it, but a couple of their tables from their presentation or from their paper. Next. Showed that, okay, so of the 8 hospitals, as you can tell, these are some fairly large hospitals, 295 beds, 334 bed VA hospital, a trauma center of 310, and then buildings anywhere from 3 to 8 stories. Next. Some of them transferred patients immediately. Some of them had a delayed evacuation. Some of them partially evacuated their hospital. Some of them evacuated them completely. If you'll notice, one had a complete evacuation of 270 patients over a 9-hour period of time. Now, the thing you've got to bear in mind, if you think about how much of a surge of patients take place following an earthquake, and then compound that with the fact that you've lost your ability to care for patients at facilities you typically rely on, thus the paradox, and certainly the pressure placed on the healthcare system and the healthcare resource and its ability to manage those patients. Next. The after-action report, again, I won't hit on this too hard. They found a problem with communications and water and food and shelter. it's really disappointing to continue to see these after action reports after disasters over the last 30 years talking about the need for interoperable communications. And yet we get to 9/11 and that seems to be a common theme. Hopefully at some point we will address that. It did point out that incident command worked well and it was necessary and it did a good job in terms of helping these facilities coordinate their discharge and a timely relocation of patients from some hospitals. Again, as you can imagine, enormous response demand was placed on the infrastructure of the healthcare system and the emergency services. Next. The response agency planning. Next. A couple of things that I remind people on a regular basis. What is your continuity of ongoing operations plan? Do you have a good food plan? And did you protect your building and protect your people? The old adage of business is diversify or, and that's what's important in disaster planning, particularly as it relates to earthquakes, put all of your eggs in one basket, make that basket safe and guard that basket. That includes your patients and certainly includes your equipment. So, conclusions to this. First of all, sometimes, you hear people say, well, I hope this never happens. I try to remind anyone who makes that statement, hope is not a substitute. We've got to plan for it. We've got to prepare for it. We've got to be, resilient in our ability to deal with these situations. Hope is never a substitute. We can't shame and use a fear factor to scare people into making the investments necessary to be sure that we are prepared for disaster. Generally, that won't last long. It certainly is helpful to remind people in a hospital environment, particularly, that this is a matter of compliance. But honestly, for any emergency responder, we've got to understand, the importance of disaster preparedness in terms of compliance. Creating an atmosphere of safety and preparedness, has to permeate all emergency services. Sometimes, we think of an emergency as a 30-minute, issue. We get the call from 911, we respond, we deal with it, and we take care of it, we're ready for the next call. And a disaster, it's hours, it's days, it's weeks, sometimes it's months. As the last presenter discussed in the ongoing issues in Haiti, that certainly was a long-term disaster response, and that's certainly something with an earthquake we could get into in the United States, and we need to be prepared for that with an atmosphere of that. And the last but not least is investment. So many times I hear people talk about, well, disaster planning and preparedness is a cost. Well, it's not a cost, it's an investment. And the return on that investment is a good successful outcome. The return on that investment is being prepared. The return on that investment, protecting our patients and certainly protecting our employees and their families. And at this point, I'll wrap up and ask if there are any questions.
I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay, well, let's do this. Let me say just a couple of concluding remarks and then we'll wrap up and take a break. First of all, again, I apologize. I got stuck in the airport in Dallas today, as you can hear by the background announcement. I do appreciate everybody working with us and again, that's another time, and that's what we did today. The point with earthquakes, sometimes we look at things based on what's relevant to what's occurred in the last week or month or year. And when it occurs in distant areas like Chile or Haiti, it's tough for us to create the correlation with how that's important to us in the United States or in Europe or in Australia. But again, folks, it is important that we have a good understanding of earthquakes. It's important that we have an understanding of what type of damage could occur with certain intensity levels, and that we're prepared for that. And we're prepared for that not just for 30 minutes, but for the hours and the weeks and the months ahead in terms of response and recovery to any disaster. And I certainly appreciate, your efforts, in, signing on to,
Thank you very much, Randy. That was a great presentation. We're going to break for 6 minutes, and we'll be back at 3 o'clock with Mark Phillips. Thank you.
oh, okay. Yeah, let me try. And also, experiencing weather-related. I just actually put on my broadband card because our home internet goes down in cold weather, cold and stormy weather, which is what we have here today. So it should be okay. Okay, great. All right, bye-bye.